We can't, any fear we have is a holy fear of offending him. Like we don't want to, we don't want to offend someone who is so worthy of our love. When we go to God, we also need to think about our motives and where we stand. I was reading a little bit about St. Bridget. A friend of mine is going to be confirmed, and she is choosing a saint, and she stumbled on St. Bridget. She's from Ireland, and there was something, I looked her up, and there was something she said that pertains to what we're about here. Is Jesus told St. Bridget that some people know that he is all-powerful, that he has good things to offer, and that they follow him for that purpose, and they pray to him, and as long as they get the good things from him, they continue in their prayer. But that's their entire motive, and they will not attain a friendship with God. They won't get a union with him, is what Jesus said. Others come to God with a great deal of fear, and they do penitential practices, and they never get past, they don't get past all that fear to knowing God, knowing his love for them, and then communing with him to grow. That's what God's purpose for us is, to grow. I love something that St. Paul said toward the end of his ministry. He said he'd been through so many travails and so many labors and so many bruises and so many beatings and everything, shipwrecks. He says, "Now I am crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." And that's wonderful. That's what we want to find for ourselves. And when we come to the end of our life, we're crucified. It's no longer I who live, it's Christ living in me. And that's such a great friendship, such a great comfort. Welcome, you guys. We're getting started, and we're talking about prayer. And we remember in this beautiful church we just prayed, we're in the presence of God. And if you feel deeply within, you can find his presence by just asking him. So to continue, there's the right way of praying to Jesus is to really seek his will, to revere him, to honor him, and place ourselves before him as a servant, and to learn from him, to follow him. Everything we do that's worthwhile in this world is done by grace. Anything that's done by purely human power is not worth it. It doesn't do anything for eternal life. It takes grace and that means God's Spirit, to do anything worthwhile for eternal life. And we go to God for that purpose. We're to pray all the time. But prayer is meaningful to the extent that we're aware of him, to whom we speak. And, vocal prayer is a beginning, and then we get into a meditative prayer, and then we go to a contemplative prayer, type of prayer, where we're connecting with God on different levels. But we have to know who it is we're talking to, and knowing, and every day, finding ways to revere God more, finding ways for the holy type of fear, a reverence. That's the basis of where we begin. And God's friendship with us does grow. We're children as well, and we can connect with God by being his children, speaking to him as his children. I know that in important times of life, that's when we really want to pray. But prayer is something it's open to us to pray at all times. That's something we can do. I wanted to tell you about this person, very interesting man who lived he was born in 1600. And you may know him already, Brother Lawrence. He was born he was a soldier in the 30-year war in Europe, 1620 or 1630, and that was just a terrible war. Nearly 20% of the population of Europe died in war and through the scourges there. And that's when Brother Lawrence was beginning. He was a soldier, he was wounded, he became lame. So in times as troubled as today, Brother Lawrence discovered, then followed a pure and uncomplicated way to walk continually in God's presence. I've come to really appreciate and love Brother Lawrence as I've learned about him. He has a little book that is called Practicing the Presence of God. It's just, I think, 7 conversations, which are on about a page and a half each, and 11 letters or 15 letters that are about a page and a half each that tell about his experience, about his way of being with God in prayer. He, when he was lamed and left the military service and the war was over, he went into the forest and he was a hermit for a while. And then he went to civil service. Then he became a footman. I'm not sure what a footman is, to the treasurer of France. And then when he was 50 years old, he entered a monastery, a newly formed monastery. And it grew up to about 150, and he worked in the kitchen. But he practiced, he saw in the books all the many different devotions that you can have, all the many ways that people seek to follow God, different practices and different disciplines. And he said, well, that's just too much for me. That won't work for me because it's just too laborious, too complicated, and too much like a cookie cutter type of situation. So he practiced the presence of God. And he began by appreciating who God was, revering him and loving him and getting to know the greatness of God, all his attributes, how kind he is, and how, when we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about someone that we know walked through Galilee, but he's also, he's the Son of God, the creator, being itself. He's the Prince of Peace. He rules the world. He overcame the power of the world. Jesus is, when we look, we can't look too high. He is very, very highly exalted, and yet he is so lowly. He comes to each one of us wanting to lead us into his heavenly kingdom. But that's how Brother Lawrence began to work with God. And so all during the day, what he determined to do is he would keep a conversation going on with God throughout the day. And you think that prayer is something that you do in the morning or in the evening, and this is personal prayer, not liturgical prayer. He did do liturgical prayer, monastic prayer as well. But no matter what he was doing, he kept a conversation going with God. When he was at work, he would ask God for the grace to do that job well. And he did everything for God. He didn't do it to please anyone else. He did it to please God, and therefore everything he did, it was a higher standard, something that would be pleasing to God. And he never attempted to do anything himself. As often as he did, he found that he failed. He came up short, that it wasn't pleasing to God. He always had to ask God for the grace. And that's important for us too. We think grace is something that we can rarely get, something that's hard to come by, something that we have to merit, something we have to work hard for, suffer for, labor for. But that's not the case at all. With Brother Lawrence found this out, and other saints in history have too, that you turn to God in your heart and say, Lord, give me the grace to do this job well for you. And no matter how menial it is, especially as menial as it is. And everyone saw that how wonderful that was for him. He was a very gentle man, and he was always full of peace and full of joy. he found that by doing that, by keeping it, and it took a lot of practice for him too, to learn to get into the habit of keeping a conversation going, but it became so rewarding to him. After a while, it would have been very hard for him to not be in constant prayer with God and constant conversation. And if he found that he came up short on doing a task, he would acknowledge that he did it poorly and that he was a bit of a worthless servant, but he would not take it too much to heart. He would admit it to God, and then he would continue on. And these things are just so healthy for us, and because God is continually answering. It's hard for us to believe, but if we ask God for his grace, he gives it to us. We ask him for grace to relationships with your home. We ask him for grace when entering a marriage. All the great things in our lives, we ask God for his grace, for his protection, for his care. And of course, we respond by being very careful to not offend God. And if we do offend, we know that it's just our weakness, that we can turn to God immediately, and he brings us into his friendship. He brings us back into his fellowship with kindness and with desire, and it gets us back to where we were to continue on the path of growth and path of friendship. That, to me, that's so delightful. And I've been, since I've been reading about Brother Lawrence, I've been doing this myself, and I was very surprised when God does give grace. And throughout the day, as many times as you ask him, during the time that we're engaged in our day, all our activities, there are so many influences that come into our lives. You may think of them as a spirit, or you may think of them however you wish. When we're around a crowd of people or angry people, that kind of gets into our system. If we're around unruly people or whatever, that we're affected by that. If we're But we're impacted by so many influences, so we kind of keep tabs of what we're feeling, and if it's not something that is pleasing to God, we dispel it, we let it go, we don't let it stay in us, so that God's influence, and we ask God for his grace, so that God's influence will come into our lives. And by doing so, our minds are strengthened, they're cleansed, and we feel more like a child of God than we do a pawn or a slave in the world. We feel the freedom and the friendship of God and a certain strength that comes from being in accord with God. By asking God for his grace and being careful as soon as we detect an influence that's harmful, that's not in accord with God, anger, envy, any undesirable feeling, influence that comes in us, we let it go. And we have to be careful about that through the day. Otherwise, God will not engage with us. That's something that Brother Lawrence taught about, and I found it to be very true. We do have to be very careful about how we're feeling, what's within us spiritually, so that we can kind of maintain a pure charity and a sense of justice about us. Brother Lawrence, he worked in a kitchen. It was a busy kitchen. There were 100 monks, and he wasn't the kind of person that was inclined to do that sort of work. But he gave himself up to it to please God, and he did well with it. And during the day at work, he would be asking God for his help, no matter how busy it was. There was always something he could be doing for picking up a straw off the floor. He found a way to offer these things to God, doing it for love of God. And so he was doing acts of love for God in the most minute things in the course of a day. And these things built the relationship, built the conversation. It's not a one-way conversation. It's two ways. God is speaking to us as well, and we're learning about how He is. We learn that when He quits talking to us, then we got to stop and pay attention. When we quit feeling His presence, when we're feeling ill, some sort of ill will of any sort, then we know that we have to turn back to Him. We learn about God, what pleases Him, and how to actually do charity. There's something I learned a long time ago. It's easy to want to do something good, but it's much more difficult to have the wisdom to know how to actually do good. So many people have a good intention, but realize they don't have the wisdom of how to do in a particular situation what they can do that would be really beneficial. Working with God, it brings us that sort of wisdom where we can understand with His inspirations what is it we can do good for those around us. We turn people off quite a bit by our forcefulness and our imposing our own ideas and our own wills being highly involved. But with God, we become gentled, and we're more pliable. We're able to have that freedom to deal with others in a more in a greater accord, and that brings that brings God's presence into the community and the folks around us. It makes a big difference. And in the midst of all this busyness of working through the day in the kitchen, and then they'd be going to prayers, Brother Lawrence found out that he would be praying always. And when he left his work to go into the monastic choir to pray the liturgical prayers, he found that he wasn't praying any more there than he was anywhere else. He was always in prayer, and God was such a great part of his life. And he wasn't a gifted man, except for he had a good will. But he got that idea that he was going to keep that would be his spirituality, is keeping that conversation with God, and he worked at it until it became second nature to him. And from there, God just builds it up because He loves to be with us. God loves for His children to be alert to Him, to have their eyes on Him, their hearts alive and open, and constantly turning to Him. And He teaches us many things. Brother Lawrence said, "Our only business was to love and delight ourselves in God. That's the primary business of the whole day, of every day. Our business is to love and delight ourselves in God, because God also takes delight in us." Brother Lawrence has a really good way of doing things. I really like him. Brother Lawrence says we can't stick to penances and all these particular exercises. His primary spirituality was the conversation with God. But I think that the Rosary and other devotions are very good if when we're praying the Rosary, if we're actually placing ourselves in the presence of Mary as we say her prayer, so that we're engaging with her in our hearts and our minds, receiving from her something of her presence, her ineffable presence. She's the mother of all the living, all those who have the grace of God, Jesus dwelling in their hearts. She is the mother of all these. So in our spirituality, our practices, if we're engaged in a personal way with, like Mary, for instance, or if we're doing a novena with a saint, we have to be very conscious of that person and be sensing any dynamicism that is taking place between us and the saint. We have to be alive to these things and very conscious. It's not this easy easiest thing in the world to keep ourselves alert and attuned. But that's where the reward is. That's where the good of prayer comes from. That's how we receive what we're really seeking, is that consolation, that comfort, that strengthening, that freedom that we receive by being alive to God and living in a way that pleases Him. If we find ourselves having habits or practices that are difficult for us to shake, that's no reason to not go to God, because He is there to help. He brings us out of those things, and we persevere with it so that we can remain out of those and become free again. It helps many people hold back from turning to God because they see something evil in themselves and they feel so unworthy. But actually, that's the time to go to the doctor and seek healing, something that God is very, very happy to do for us. All things are possible to him who believes and prays and asking God for his help. They are less difficult to him who hopes, and they are easy to him who loves, and still more easy to him who perseveres in the practice of these virtues of hoping in God and believing in God. Faith is something that we don't have an accurate estimate of, generally speaking. We think that it's believing in a certain dogma and certain creeds and believing by a confession of sort of faith, but faith is a recognition of God. God always reveals himself, and when we recognize him and accept him, that's when faith comes to fruition, and we receive that life. Gosh, time is going by a little faster than I expected here. I could go on and on about Brother Lawrence, but I know that his material, it would take you less than an hour to read all his material, and you would get the gist of it. You underline what you like and then go back and look at it over and over. But right now I want to shift over into another part of what I want to talk about, and that's the battle of prayer. A battle means that there is a struggle, and there's hardship, and there's an enemy. There's a lot at stake with our prayer and our relationship with God, and we're dealing with ourselves, our weaknesses, when we talk about a battle, our own exposure to the forces in the world and our own fervor and our wherewithal to pray. All this becomes part of it. I keep telling people there's a great and powerful devil roaming through the world doing everything he can to harm the people of God. And if we just have to be aware of that and be ready and able to cling to God and do the practices of virtues so we can overcome the assaults of the devil. The battle of prayer we face in ourselves is different wrong notions of prayer. Some people say prayer is just a psychological activity, and others say it's sort of an effort of concentration, and still others reduce prayer to ritual words and postures. And many Christians regard prayer as an occupation that's incompatible with what they do. They don't have the faith to realize that God, who made the world and everything in it and all human relationships, the very natural law that our nature is governed by, that God made these things, and he is the one who can make them right and help us to function properly. But those are some wrong attitudes about prayer. And there's other attitudes that this world, the present world that doesn't believe in God, that can penetrate our lives if we're not careful. For instance, in the age of science, if science is sort of nearsighted, it has science and it does so much, it's so great, but they don't see beyond it into the realm of mystery and faith and love of God. And then people say that there's aspects of the only valuable thing is production and what's profit, and that prayer is useless. All these things have to do with our attitude, and we have to get over that. We find in our prayer a connection with God, and we persevere in it, and God is the one who picks these things up. Your very presence here is a witness that God is calling you to grow in relationship with Him. In your hearts, you're desiring to connect with God, finding a way to connect, and that's why you're here, and that's why I'm speaking to you too. Is I too want to love God more. I want to know more about God, and to grow as well, and to be taught by God. We face, there's all sorts of temptations in prayer, but a lot of times it's a lack of faith. One of the most difficult things that we face in prayer is that we love many things, and our our priorities are totally skewed toward the world and not away from God. So we have to put our loves in order. When we find ourselves praying, when we're praying to God and we find our minds wander to this thing and that thing, a new car we're going to buy, a house that we're going to do, the rent that we got to pay, all these things. We think about our love. Where is our love? And we've got to work on ourselves to get our priorities straight. And by going to God and asking Him for the grace to get our hearts in order, we really greatly underestimate the power that the influence of the world has on us. But turning to God, He gives us His help. It's something that you have to experience yourself. I'm sure you do to some extent already, but we always need to improve, being very mindful that the things we love are a little bit out of kilter with having that joy with God. And that's why Brother Lawrence's way of continual conversation is so helpful. By being engaged with God continually, that makes our love change. We're rewarded for being with God in that way. Another way of prayer that I just want to mention in the last few minutes is praying with the Bible. That's not something people do very much anymore. And I remember my grandfather, he was actually a Methodist, but he would sit in his sitting chair in the evening with the Bible in his lap, and he would just be turning the pages, and it was every evening. Some people like to watch a particular television program, and he did watch a program or two, but that was a large part of his evening. He would have the Bible in his lap, and he would read, and then he would be thinking, and maybe have a conversation with his wife, but then he would read some more and just be turning the pages. And God, the Word of God, we believe that God is speaking to us when we have His Word in our hand and are absorbing it and thinking about it. When we read the Scripture like that, we'll find that early in the morning something will dawn on us. We'll make connections, and God is speaking to us in it, and we grow, and it fills us with joy. Reading is something that we have to be a little bit critical about, being careful what it is we read, making sure we have a proper understanding, and we kind of mull over it. The Beatitudes are the most beautiful things in the Bible, I think. And, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So when we're reading something like that, for instance, we would read it, blessed are the poor in spirit. And then you start asking yourself questions. What is it? What is poor in spirit? And for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What does that mean? And we think about those things and we desire those. And so that's when we start praying. We start asking God, God, I want to go to heaven. Help me. And God, what is the poor in spirit? Make me like that too. And we listen to what God has to say to us. He answers, surely he answers in the course of the days. And we feel it and we accept it because God is always transcending us just a little bit. We can never actually get our hand on it, but it's there. It has an influence on us, and it changes us. It's not quite like a friend where you can grab them and say, let's talk about this. God is always just a little bit beyond, but nevertheless, it is a relationship that we grow out of love. And Brother Lawrence is someone who made a great lifetime treasure. He lived like that 30 years, almost 40 years before he died in the friendship of God. And he was full of joy the whole time. In everything he did, he turned to God for help. And as soon as he finished a job, he would say, thank you for the grace of doing that well. If he didn't do it well, he would say, he would ask forgiveness, but he wouldn't let it bother him. He would keep on cheerfully knowing how God is so gentle and kind to carry on. That's probably about all I want to talk about for the evening. Does anyone have any comments or anything they would like to say? Yes. Yes. Well, I know you're right. I always hesitate before getting too rowdy with God, but yes, when we're human, of course. Well, we're human. We get frustrated. We want to get things straight, and God sometimes He doesn't. We have to pry it out of Him before He'll yield to us. But He is our Father, and He feels responsibility too to His children. So we treat Him as our friend, but it's always we got to revere God for sure, or else we become fools. But His children know the ring of truth, and we can pick up on His vibes when it's time to show a little more respect. But yeah, I absolutely agree with you. We can't be shy with God. We have to be very real with Him, and He appreciates that too. That seeing some courage out of His children. Thank you for that comment. Very good. Well, that's Brother Lawrence practicing the presence of God. It's good literature. Just Google it, and it's there. I encourage you to read it. Thank you, everyone.